Thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of the beautiful Byzantine Greek manuscripts in the collections curated by Museum of the Bible. It's an honor to be here and to be able to present to the Orientale Lumen Conference. When Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. opened its doors to the public in November 2017, it was the culmination of a project that had begun in 2009 with the purchase of 2 manuscripts for the Green Collection of Oklahoma City. The first was a 14th century Latin Psalter with Middle English translation and commentary by the English mystic Blessed Richard Rolle. The second was 137 palimpsest leaves of the Codex Climaci Rescriptus, containing an overtext in Syriac and undertexts in Christian, Palestinian, Aramaic, and Greek. Since 2009, the manuscript collection grew rapidly, and the Green Collection began donating manuscripts to Museum of the Bible and the Signatory Organization. Today, the staff of Museum of the Bible curates all 3 collections. The combined number of manuscripts in these 3 collections is 455 in at least 17 different languages. Almost 3/4 of the collection, 331 manuscripts, are in Hebrew or Latin, and the total number of Greek manuscripts is 18. These manuscripts range in date from late 3rd to early 4th century, the Bodmer Papyri that my colleague Daniel Stevens will be speaking about, to the 16th century, and they come from various places in the Greek-speaking world. For this presentation, I will focus on 3 Byzantine Gospel books and a lectionary in the collection. As I have worked on the provenance for these manuscripts, there have been occasional surprises, and often the information provided by dealers has been incomplete or misleading, which has complicated the process. Manuscript 139, a gospel book known as the Evanus Gospels. The handwriting and illuminations in this small manuscript, dated to 1050 to 1100 by Nadezhda Kavros-Hoffman and Yuri Pianitsky, closely resemble what is found in Jerusalem Codex Tafu 56. This makes it likely that this manuscript was produced by the same scribe and in the same location. Therefore, Kavros-Hoffman and Pianitsky concluded the manuscript likely originated at the Great Lavra of St. Sabas in Palestine. Due to the rebinding of the manuscript in the late 19th or early 20th century, any marks of ownership were lost. Because the final quires of the manuscript are missing, it also lacks a colophon. A French customs sticker inside the front cover points to ownership in France. The dealer note said that it had belonged to the architect Michel Rouspitz and had passed to his daughter at his death in 1957. There are photographs of this manuscript in the archives of the University of Chicago. The Chicago professor, Harold Willoughby, had examined the photos and named the manuscript the Evanus Gospels. Kavros-Hoffman and Pianitsky examined the manuscript just as it was going on the market in 2008. At that time, the manuscript was unknown to scholars and lacked a Gregory Allen or GA number. They assumed that a private collector had bought the manuscript. 2 years later, in 2010, the Green Collection purchased it from Les Lumineurs. In 2014, the Green Collection donated it to the museum. Then in 2015, the Museum Scholars Initiative sponsored Dr. Tame Wasserman, a professor of biblical studies at Ansgar Teologiske Høgskole, Kristiansand, Norway, to examine the New Testament manuscripts. With the help of Maurice Robinson, Emeritus Senior Professor of New Testament Studies at Southeastern Baptist Seminary, Dr. Wasserman confirmed that the manuscript did not yet have a GA number. He contacted the Institute für Neutestamentliche Forschung at the University of Münster, which assigned the number GA 2929. The canon tables are separated by columns supporting arches with abbreviations of the evangelist's name under the arches. Most of the columns have floral decoration, but some have zoomorphic birds or dragons at the upper corners. The text is written in a small Perlschrift minuscule that exhibits many distinctive features in common with Jerusalem Codex Tafu 56. The scribe wrote the text in one column of 22 lines per page. The text lacks the final chapters of John, ending in the middle of John 17:22. Two miniatures remain. The one of Mark shows the evangelist seated on a cushion as he begins to read the text which says archi with a final iota 2. On the facing page, the beginning is spelled correctly, arche with an eta 2. Kavros Hoffman and Pianitsky pointed this out as this misspelling as an example of eoticism. The second miniature portrays John dictating his gospel to his scribe Prochorus. The text on the facing page has faded in many places, and someone retouched the first words of the gospel. Both miniatures have deep blue skies, a feature that points to production in the eastern portions of the Byzantine Empire, especially Syria and Palestine. A pie-shaped headpiece in magenta, blue, green, and gold introduces the Gospel of Matthew. Three other gospel headpieces are straight bands decorated in a similar fashion. The heading for each gospel appears in gold majuscules, and each first initial is decorated in a colorful floral pattern. Despite the small size of this manuscript, it is a lavish production whose quality compares favorably to contemporary manuscripts produced in Constantinople. The next manuscript, manuscript 474, the Usher Gospels. And I have an example of the Usher Gospels here. This small 2-volume gospel manuscript dates to the 12th century and has a well-documented provenance history reaching back to the late 16th century. The minuscule text is carefully written by 2 scribes in a clear, well-executed hand. The text is in 1 column with 18 lines to the page. The manuscript is far less lavish than the preceding one. There are no miniatures in it, yet it contains a series of 14 fully decorated canon tables. In each, a series of 3 green and blue columns support an arched golden superstructure outlined in red and decorated with floral decorations. The columns themselves contain an intricate design which creates the impression of marbled stone. Each column rests on a rounded base and has an urn-shaped capital. Both the bases and capitals are painted in contrasting colors. The beginning of each gospel is marked with a simple text in a tablet in place of an elaborate headband. Although the manuscript's small size and plain decoration clearly indicate this was produced for private devotion, it nevertheless contains liturgical rubrics throughout. There is a list for the daily gospel readings throughout the church calendar appended at the end. In his description of the manuscript, Georgy Parpalov noted that it is the work of 2 anonymous scribes, one of whom is the same scribe who copied 2 other gospel books, one currently in Melbourne, Australia, and one in Venice, Italy, and added the prefatory material to a 3rd manuscript from Constantinople, currently in the Getty collection, that is dated to 1133. The second scribe is known from a manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale. These features point to Constantinople as the likely source of this manuscript, but it made its way to the West at some point after the 14th century when prefaces and verses were added to it. Parpalov noted that several short marginal glosses in a late Gothic hand helped to explain abbreviations in the Greek text. Some of these date to the 16th century or later, when the owner's first language was English. On folio 15 recto, the words as, then, and this appear in the right margin. The manuscript has passed through the hands of some important collectors over the centuries. In the mid-17th century, James Usher, the Anglican Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, owned it. Usher was a famed theologian, scholar, and linguist who today is best remembered for his chronology of the world that dated the creation of the world to 4004 BC. The English Civil War caused Usher to leave Ireland for England in 1640. After his death in 1656, his daughter donated the manuscript to the library of Trinity College, Dublin, where it remained until 1702. A scholar then borrowed it and never returned it. When he died, it entered the market, passing from owner to owner until it entered the collection of John Rawdon, the first Earl of Moira. His son, Francis Rawdon Hastings had antiquarian interests and inherited the manuscript, but is better known as a British Army officer who served in the American Revolution, beginning with Bunker Hill, where he earned the praise of General Cornwallis for leading the final assault on the American lines. In John Trumbull's painting, The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, Rawdon Hastings can be seen in the background, waving the British flag and leading the final charge. After some short service in the era of the Napoleonic Wars, he became Governor General of India from 1813 to 1823, and he greatly expanded British control on the subcontinent. The manuscript stayed in the Hastings family until 1868, when it passed into the possession of their relatives, the family of the Marquess of Bute, where it remained for over a century. Afterwards, it became part of the Scoian collection until the Green Collection purchased it in 2011 and donated it to Museum of the Bible in 2014. The third manuscript is another gospel manuscript, Manuscript 352. This manuscript originated in southern Italy around the year 1000. Several scribes produced the manuscript, and someone added a synaxarium about a century later. The text is written in minuscule hands that lack the elegant delicacy of the first two manuscripts. Nevertheless, the manuscript was carefully copied and decorated. The text is in 2 columns of 27 lines each. Many of the initials in the margins have been rubricated. The 10 canon tables are framed by colorful columns composed of interwoven bands of red, blue, yellow, and white, supporting 2 arches. No 2 columns are exactly alike. At the end of the letter from Eusebius to Carpianus, there is a cross composed of interwoven bands of red, blue, and white. The headpiece for the Gospel of Matthew consists of braided vines topped with another cross outlined in yellow. The remaining headpieces are much simpler, those for Mark and John being a simple panel containing interwoven red and white vines. The headpiece for Luke surrounds the title. On the facing page, below the end of the Kephalia, a twisted red and white border has a dragon's head and tail, which is not the only zoomorphic element in this manuscript. The initial alpha of arche at the beginning of Mark consists of a red and white bird perched on an upright containing interlaced red and white vines. The Green Collection purchased the manuscript at an auction in 2011 and donated it to Museum of the Bible in 2014. Since there was no GA number associated with it, in October 2019, I sent the auction house description to Dr. Greg Paulson of the University of Münster's INTF to see if he had any information about the manuscript. He asked for pictures of the pericope adulteri in John. When I found the passage on folio 195 recto and verso, I noticed each line of the passage was marked by a star to the left of it. I sent him the pictures and asked about the stars, which I had not seen in a manuscript before. He replied that the stars were the reason he had asked to see the passage. He added, and I quote, "The manuscript is GA 1429, which has been missing for many years from Kozinica. I'm attaching the entry for 1429 in Gregory's text critique, which mentions the stars marking the pericope adulteri, in German, Ehebruch." Kozinica Monastery, or the Theotokos I Kosiphanica Monastery as it is more properly called, near Drama, Greece, was targeted by Bulgarian partisans known as Komitagi in a raid on March 27, 1917. A Czech journalist named Vladimir Sis accompanied them. He had visited the monastery the preceding year and had noted what treasures it contained. The partisans beat a couple of the oldest monks until they revealed where everything was hidden. The partisans then looted the monastery and carried off 431 manuscripts, valuable early printed books, precious objects, and 3,000 drachmas in cash. 24 pack mules were needed to transport the loot to Sofia. A few days later, the band struck another monastery near Serious. To keep track of the manuscripts, Sis made a catalog and noted the origin of the Kozinica manuscripts with the initials MK. The same initials written in red pencil appear inside the back cover of the manuscript. After World War I ended, Sis sold some of the manuscripts in Germany, and his wife sold some in Prague. Most remained in Sofia, where they became part of the collection of the Evanus Center for Slavo-Byzantine Studies. At least 13 of the center's manuscripts have the same initials, MK, inside the back cover. Upon learning that the manuscript had come from Kozinica, the museum immediately began a process of examining its provenance that eventually led to the decision to return it to Greece. The manuscript had stayed in Italy for several centuries before being brought to Greece. It is uncertain when it left Italy, but by 1885 it was part of the collection of the Kozinica Monastery, according to a publication that year by Athanasios Papadopoulos Karamos. On one possible date for its travel to Greece could be the 16th century, because it has a similar binding to the lectionary below. In 1909, Caspar René Gregory listed the manuscript in Textkritik des Neuen Testamentes and assigned the GA number 1429 to the manuscript. After Sis sold the manuscript, it disappeared for a few decades, but it resurfaced in a 1958 catalog by the New York bookseller H.P. Krauss. It then disappeared again until the auction in 2011. The provenance information confirmed that the manuscript had come from the Kozinica Monastery, and the initials MK indicated that it was there on March 27, 1917, when the partisans looted the monastery. The course of action was clear for the museum. In early 2020, our chief curatorial officer, Jeff Kloa, contacted representatives of the Greek Orthodox Church, who were surprised and delighted by the news that the museum was voluntarily returning the manuscript to them without being asked to do so. Eventually, an agreement was reached to transfer ownership of the manuscript to the church immediately and to display the manuscript until His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew visits the museum this October. At that time, the museum will hand it over to him personally. My fourth and final manuscript, manuscript 469, is a gospel lectionary, and that's the large one that's right there. This large lectionary contains parchment folios dated to circa 1050 to 1080 and 49 paper leaves dated to circa 1543. Georgy Parpalov studied the manuscript in 2011 and dated the two parts based on internal clues. The text of the parchment section is written in a clear Perlschrift minuscule in columns of 23 lines each. Parpalov called this a standard Byzantine calligraphic hand of the late 10th and 11th centuries. One important feature of the manuscript is the presence of ekphonetic musical notation throughout the parchment portions. These signs, written in red above each line of text, aided in the proper chanting of every liturgical reading contained in the lectionary. The large format of the manuscript made the notation easier to see. Parpalov noted that the list of church feast days celebrated in the text was very similar to the list found in the Jaharis lectionary of the Metropolitan Museum's collection. Since it has been determined that the Jaharis lectionary was made in Constantinople, possibly for use in Hagia Sophia itself, Parpalov wrote that this lectionary likely also originated in Constantinople. However, the lectionary in our collection has no connection with Hagia Sophia. Parpalov noted that the feast of St. Theodore the Recruit, also known as the Great Martyr Theodore, on February 17th, is marked off with special attention. He suggested that the lectionary was created for use in a church dedicated to the saint. If this is correct, it is not certain which church of St. Theodore was the recipient. The first church of St. Theodore in Constantinople dates to circa AD 452, and there were several more churches dedicated to him in the city over the next 1,000 years. At some point after the manuscript's creation, a large portion at the beginning of the manuscript needed to be replaced. It is unclear whether normal wear and tear or some other type of damage necessitated these repairs. The first 48 folios were copied on paper in 2 columns of 23 lines to match the original parchment. A 49th paper folio contains the manuscript's only miniature, a portrait of the evangelist Matthew. The saint sits in a chair and reads a scroll with the opening words of his gospel. The paint of his cloak is badly flaked, exposing the lines that the artist drew to mark the folds. Parpaloff used watermarks on the paper of the folios to date this portion of the manuscript to circa 1543. He added that the binding of the Greek type, a green and gold patterned silken velvet over wooden boards, likely dates to about the same time, which, as noted above, could also give an estimate of when the Gospel manuscript made its way to Greece from Italy. The manuscript contains a few marks of ownership. Parpaloff noted inscriptions mentioning a person, perhaps named Gabriel, Metropolitan of Sardis. If this reading is correct, it is problematic. After Tamerlane's destruction of the city in 1402, ecclesiastical authority transferred to nearby Philadelphia. But there are at least 2 known people with the title of Bishop of Sardis from 1437 and 1450, respectively. Dated inscriptions in the manuscript from the mid-19th century mention the activities of a certain Father Andrew in 1849 and his death in 1858. At some point in the late 20th century, it entered the Scoian collection. The Green collection acquired it from Lea and Lumineur in 2012 and donated it to Museum of the Bible in 2014. So this is just a sample of the Greek manuscripts in the collections of Museum of the Bible. The entire collection is diverse in origin, representing different parts of the Byzantine Empire. They contain different styles of script and decoration, and were created for clients of different social and economic levels. Taken together with our papyri, they bear witness to centuries of preserving and practicing the Orthodox faith.
Hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference. I am thrilled to present, along with my colleague Brian Hyland, some of the Greek manuscripts in the collections curated at the Museum of the Bible. Today, I'll be giving a brief introduction to possibly my favorite manuscript within our collections, a 3rd or 4th century papyrus codex of the Psalms, known variously as the Bodmer Psalms, Bodmer 24, Rolf's 2110, or Manuscript 170. Naming conventions are wild and make no sense. The plan of this brief presentation is as follows. First, I will briefly spend some time discussing the provenance and history of this manuscript. Then, I will provide a summary of its various features, and then, finally, I will spend a short amount of time reflecting on the potential relationship between some of this manuscript's features and its liturgical use in its community in late antiquity. So, let's begin. It is impossible to be more specific than to say that this codex was produced somewhere in Egypt, sometime in either the 3rd or early 4th century. We may, as some scholars have argued, and I will discuss a bit later, have an idea of where it was used and where it was deposited, but we cannot say for a certainty even that that was its place of creation, though it may well have been. While it is true that the text of this manuscript bears certain affinities for that of the Sahidic version of the Psalms, in the relevant time period, this is not enough to narrow down the location of production. And while this manuscript was included with the other Bodmer papyri, that is those purchased by Swiss collector Martin Bodmer and subsequently displayed by the Bodmer Library or the Fondation Martin Bodmer, its original editors concluded that it could not have been a part of the finds that made up Bodmer papyri 2 to 16 or 18 to 23. So it's at least not from those places. That it is so well preserved, again, according to its editors, suggests that it was found somewhere outside of the Nile Delta, but little more than that can be said from the material evidence of the manuscript itself. For any more specific information, we have to rely on the stories told by dealers and collectors, which, as always, should be viewed with a measure of healthy distrust. Like most papyri discovered in Egypt, this manuscript has an all too familiar find story, the details of which are largely unverifiable. In one scholar, James Robinson's reconstruction of events, which also involves an unsourced claim of another scholar verifying part of it by seeing a photograph, Martin Bodmer purchased this manuscript, along with others, in Cairo from a dealer named Phocion Tano, sometime between the years of 1952 and 1958. Tano, reportedly, after a convoluted trail of accusations, arrests, and one trial, received this manuscript and several others from 2 men who allegedly discovered them. These men, Hassan Muhammad al-Saman and Muhammad Khalil al-Azuzi, reportedly found a jar containing books near the town of Dishna in Upper Egypt. These books are collectively referred to as the Dishna Papers, or by more skeptical scholars as the so-called Dishna Papers. After some time, those manuscripts made their way to Tano, who sold them over a period of years to several dealers, or several collectors, at least two. It is, of course, impossible to verify that Dishna is where the group of manuscripts, if it even is a group, was found, or whether the manuscript that we're considering today, this Codex of the Psalms, was a part of that find. However, there has never been a competing story for these manuscripts, and there does seem to be some corroborating circumstantial evidence in the fact that it came from the same dealer at the right time. In addition, James Robinson has argued that the Dishna papers, which he does view as a single find or set of finds, constitute texts from the library of the monastery of Pachomius the Great at Pabao, the second monastery founded by the saint. He then argues that these documents were likely interred in the ground around the time that Justinian's troops overtook the monastery during the Chalcedonian and Monophysite controversy. Although they're less confident in their reconstructions, Albert Pietersma and Susan Comstock argue that one such Dishna paper, Crosby-Scoian manuscript number 193, a collection of Paschal texts, does indeed have Pachomian origin. If all this is in fact connected, and if this manuscript is from this find, then it would mean that the Bodmer Psalms could be a Psalter for the communal use of at least the Greek-speaking contingent of the Pachomian monastery at Pabao from its earliest days. So much for origin and provenance. Let's move on to describe the manuscript itself. From what remains, we can infer that this Psalter was once complete, containing all 151 psalms across 42 folios, though likely the outermost would have served as a kind of cover. Or it would be 168 pages, as we commonly think of them today. Each would have measured about 24 by 13 centimeters. Fragments of 34 of those 42 folios remain. The Codex was initially constructed as a single gathering and seems to have been stitched to the center. This binding, either during its use in antiquity or the long centuries of its disuse, broke, leaving the manuscript in defoliated pages as we now see it. As such, individual pages, recto and verso, or fragments thereof, are all that remain. These pages range from nearly completely preserved to incredibly fragmentary. These pages were numbered in antiquity, though twice the scribe incorrectly put a delta for a gamma in the numbers for 153 and 73. On the first occasion, though, this, though not corrected, didn't cause any errors in the numbering of the manuscript, whereas the second error propagated through what remains. While the initial editors raised the possibility that this codex was repaired or composite in antiquity, since, as I'll discuss soon, different scribes work in the text, it seems to be of uniform construction, as the vertical fibers of every folio face toward the center, or rather face toward the cover of the codex. The work of two scribes is evident in this manuscript. One, called Scribe A, copied from somewhere before the extant manuscript begins until Psalm 109-110, on what would have been page 108. Then a second scribe, Scribe B, rather creatively named, finishes out the extant manuscript. It is unclear whether Scribe B continued to the end of the Psalter, but it seems clear that the manuscript was copied sequentially and not piecemeal with the different scribes working at the same time, since the portions left of the binding on the folios on which Scribe B wrote contain Scribe A's work. The two scribes differ somewhat in hand, neither ever reaching what would be called excellence, though both are very readable throughout. Scribe A writes in a relatively small upright hand with some semi-cursive tendencies, while Scribe B writes a bit more largely, having both fewer letters per line and lines per page. Scribe A also seems to have been a more zealous corrector, with an average of 4 corrections per page, whereas Scribe B only corrects his, or as it most likely was his, writing once every 2 pages. Both, however, have a good number of errors that made it through unscathed, and there isn't any clear evidence of a corrector working after the copying process, so it seems like the scribes were on their own. The vast majority of errors are small and what one would suspect in any Greek manuscript copy by hand. Homophonous vowels are swapped, as are letters of similar shape. Occasionally it seems a line or even a full page of the exemplar is skipped. Sometimes what may be the 3rd or 4th century Egyptian accent of the scribes comes through as well, reducing certain consonant clusters and altering certain vowels, really anything that would have been hard for them to repeat to themselves. The occasion for the switch between scribes on a single page at Psalm 109-110, depending on your numbering system, is incredibly odd, and possibly suggests that the switch was prearranged or agreed at an agreed upon psalm number, as opposed to at a certain number of pages work, as scribes who didn't care about the content of what was being copied would normally have done things. The text itself, as I said at the outset, shows most affinity for the Sahidic version, and it is the earliest Greek witness to some variants contained in that tradition. There is also, however, a strong affinity with the Hebrew Masoretic tradition of the Psalms, and on multiple occasions it agrees with that tradition against the commonly accepted reconstructed reading of the Old Greek text. Because of this, there's been some debate as to whether or not this manuscript, or its exemplar, was influenced by Origen's hexapla or a recension similar to it. The format of this text, as you can see, is a single column, as are all the other Dishna papers, and it's what we would call prose format. That is, the half verses, the stichoi of the Psalms, are not separated by line breaks or indentation. And this isn't entirely unusual for the period, as stichographic presentation of the Psalms is not standardized in the papyri, nor was it regular in earlier material like the Dead Sea Scrolls. The paratextual features of the manuscript, however, are also worth mentioning. And by paratextual features, I mean everything that isn't the words themselves. So everything like punctuation, indentation, random dots and scribbles. And this will segue as well into my reflection on possible clues to the liturgical use of the Psalter. As is expected from a manuscript of this period, accentuation, diaeresis, sense punctuation is entirely uncommon. One exception to this is the frequent use of the dicolon and the colon, double dot and single dot, to mark off the verses and half verses of the poetry of the Psalms. Now, this is not an innovation of this manuscript, and indeed is found in some Jewish scrolls of the Greek Psalms as well, but it is noteworthy for how frequently it is employed, pretty consistently throughout the entire manuscript, actually. The Psalms are, of course, individually numbered, but the numbering system in this manuscript is unique. Sometimes it agrees with the usual Greek numbering, sometimes with the later Masoretic numbering, sometimes only with the Sahidic numbering system, and it switches between systems at what seem to be random intervals. Some of this might be explicable by a numbering error or two, but some of it at least seems intentional as well, and it is just a little bit bizarre on that front. The beginnings and the endings of Psalms are also wildly inconsistent in their formatting. At times, the Psalms practically run into each other. At other times, decorative elements such as dicola, paragraphoi, or other designs of various combinations are introduced to separate Psalms. And at yet other times, spacing between lines is used, occasionally somewhat extravagantly between one psalm and the next. So now, at this point, I'm going to stop describing the manuscript and provide some unfinished thoughts on the way in which two of these features might provide a window into the liturgical use of the Psalter by its community, which may have been the Pachomian monastery at Pabao. These are preliminary suggestions of an ongoing academic work, so everything that I'm about to say is of course tentative, and I welcome your thoughts. A principle that I will operate with is that if the scribe chose to add a feature to the text, he had a reason for doing so. It is not always possible that we can discern that reason, but I think it is fair to assume that scribes were not irrational and that genuine choices imply genuine motives. A second principle, and this has been argued rather persuasively by Larry Hurtado, is that many of the features included in and adapted by early Christian manuscripts had some purpose in aiding specifically liturgical reading of the manuscripts. That is, Christian manuscripts tend to have features that manuscripts intended purely for private reading or even purely for reading in educated circles do not have. And the best explanation for this is that they are to aid the varied individuals who would approach these manuscripts in reading or chanting the material out loud in worship. The two features that I hope to briefly examine are seemingly nonsensical uses of the dicola, the double dot punctuation, and psalms with particularly large introductory spaces. When I say nonsensical use of dicola, I mean the use of that double dot punctuation in a way that does not correspond to any discernible sense division. Some of these happen within clauses, and others, more frustratingly if you're trying to figure out what they mean, occur within phrases. As such, there is no possible grammatical division that these correspond to. These seemingly nonsensical marks occur periodically throughout the manuscript, and there being dicola, double dots, instead of just simple dots, makes it unlikely, at least to me, that they're accidental drops of ink. So what are the options for these errant punctuation marks? The first is that somehow they're just genuine mistakes. Some scholars have taken that route and says you don't even need to include them in editions of this manuscript. The second is that they do reflect some feature of the manuscript's exemplar instead of an edition by the scribe, and that exemplar is now lost to us. But that doesn't really solve the problem. That only pushes the question back one stage and provides no answers. A third option is that they do represent some sort of sense division in the scribe's mind, but that mind is, for some reason, inscrutable to us. Technically possible, but strange. A final option, and what I argue for, is that these are the locations at which the scribes knew of some feature of the chanting that was traditional and wanted to represent it graphically. I'd guess that this would be the same chanted feature represented by what every other double dot in this manuscript at the end of a poetic line would mean, presumably either a pause or an extended note. Continuing this manuscript's odd connection to the later Hebrew Masoretic tradition, I can say that at every nonsensical point I've found, and have been able to check for so far, it is an incomplete study, they correspond to disjunctive accents, and again, particular ones that seem to suggest either the sustaining of a note or a significant break. But that is the most I can say about that for now. The second odd feature, as commented before, is the way certain psalms are given significant amounts of introductory space. The normal concern of a scribe, unless being paid lavishly, was economy of space. The very prose format of this manuscript, when poetic formats were known, suggests that this was at least somewhat a concern for these scribes. And yet, contrary to their normal practice, at certain points, a comparatively lavish amount of space is left between psalms. Sometimes this can potentially, though not certainly, be explained by the length of the psalm's superscription. However, at other times, this cannot be the case. I argue, instead, that these spacious introductions are likely to precede psalms that were liturgically significant to the community that produced this Psalter. That is, they were spaces to help you find the psalms you know you're looking for. Either psalms of great theological significance, like Psalm 110, which has one of these spaces, or psalms that were used with a particular frequency, perhaps regularly at Lord's Day services, which was potentially the case for Psalm 65, which has one of these spaces, or on particular holy days. We do not fully know the liturgical calendar or the practices of the Egyptian church in the 3rd or 4th centuries. It'd be great if we did so we could check. However, these generously introduced psalms might provide a window into those songs of worship that were most frequently used or marked out for particular holy days within at least one Christian community at that time. Perhaps then, through these paratextual markers and spacings, things that you would tend to ignore in a manuscript, we have a glimpse into the ways in which Scripture, or at least this one volume of Scripture, was used liturgically, and the ways in which the varying copying of Scripture could have aided that liturgical use.